Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, Critical Discussions in Critical Times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, Critical Discussions in these Critical Times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. On the podcast today, I want to talk about military spending and Canada's defense, and something that we haven't talked about very often in this podcast. All the years I was doing talk radio in Southern Ontario, we didn't talk much about it. As a matter of fact, Canadians have not talked much about it. Well, that was then, and this is now. This is a different era in which we're living. Some would suggest a more dangerous era in which we're living, and I think there's a lot of legitimacy to that. And it seems that Prime Minister Mark Carney is aware of that, has been talking about that. He did talk about that during the election campaign and has acted on it. Just moments before we started the podcast today, the Prime Minister announced that Canada will meet its NATO commitment of 2% of GDP, gross domestic product, to military spending. That was a bar that was set by NATO actually only about 10 years ago. But Canada has never met that target, even though they agreed to it at the time, thought it was a wonderful idea. We've been laggard in this. Let's be honest about this. Justin Trudeau's prime minister, the 10 years as his leadership basically was, whatever, we're spending. And they talk about it at G7 meetings. They talk about it at NATO meetings. But Canada just always seemed to fall behind. Well, as we said, it's about time that something had to happen here. And the prime minister has made this commitment. And this is, to put this in context, a huge commitment that Carney is making to move us up to 2% by the end of this year. That was the commitment that the Prime Minister made today, is going to be monumental. The estimates I've seen are upwards of $20 billion in extra spending that has to be made. And when you look at where we are right now, which estimates are, we're about 1.4% of GDP, and then we're going to move that up to 2%. Very costly? Yes, it is. Very necessary? Yes, it is. And Canadians may not feel comfortable about that fact, but that is the fact. These are difficult times. I talk about right at the beginning of the podcast, difficult decisions during these difficult times. These are difficult times. There's an awful lot at play here that we need to talk about, and certainly the Prime Minister has taken into consideration, including Canada's defense. And yes, defense. We're not necessarily going back to the Cold War days of the early 1960s, but we are facing a situation right now where we have very aggressive Russian moves. Of course, we know in Eastern Europe and certainly in Ukraine, a buildup in the Arctic. That's our border. That's our northern border. And we've got to do something about that. Plus, the elephant in the room is the United States pressure that's coming from Donald Trump and his administration that Canada can and must spend more on military. And as we've talked about on the podcast, there's a legitimate argument for that. Basically, Carney is looking at this scenario that's happening and deciding, okay, it's about time for us to act. The implications of this are monumental. I want to talk about that for just a second. $20 billion in extra spending. So where's that going to go? Well, certainly with staffing. We don't have enough people in our military. That's been a problem for quite some time. The ones that are there don't get paid enough. That's a concern and something that we've heard constantly when people have done analysis of Canadian military concerns and problems. We don't retain people in the military, and that can be a problem. Now, that of course means you have to dig a lot deeper to find out exactly why. Some of that is living conditions, salary that we just talked about, attitude, chain of command. Let's face it, one of the other elements to this was also the numerous reports and allegations and inquiries about sexual harassment and things of this nature within the military. Have we done enough about that? I think the short answer is absolutely not. Is it a place that can attract people to go to the Canadian military, whichever arm of the military it is, as a career? There was a time when that actually was actually very positive attitude, and people were doing that. Not so much now. So they got to sell themselves. The Canadian military, the Defense Department, and the Canadian government have to sell the Canadian military as a career that Canadians could and should be interested in. That's going to be a tough sell, and it could be one of the major elements in moving us toward not just the target of 2%, but let's face it, being there and being ready to work with NATO in so many different things that they're concerned about these days, including, of course, Eastern Europe and our northern border and other elements of this. Let's not kid ourselves. We talked about with what's happening with Afghanistan, still a very big problem. What's going on in Ukraine and Eastern Europe and the concerns many people, especially in NATO, have about just how far Putin would be willing to go. Is Poland next? That sounded so far-reaching some years ago, not so much anymore. And the fact that Canada, even now, with their military commitment to NATO, has a presence in the South China Sea, for instance, and have had incursions and run-ins with Chinese military as a result. That's something that has to be looked at and something that we need to be aware of. So there's so much going on right now, and that's why the increase in spending, I think, is so very necessary at this stage. Now, the other element, of course, is where's the money going to come from? An extra $20 billion and more possibly in the future. The government hasn't announced that yet. That's going to be a very difficult decision because I know there are people that still to this day adamantly feel that, look, that's not something we should be spending money on. We have housing crises. We have cost of living crises. We can't afford groceries. That's where the government should be gearing its energies. And they're right. Those are all legitimate questions, but you can't focus singularly on that and ignore other elements and other responsibilities, frankly, that we have. We are a member of the G7, the G20, and certainly of NATO, and with that membership comes responsibility, and we have not been living up to those responsibilities. Now, having said that, this is not time for us to put the toolkit away and simply say, well, we're going to meet the 2% target, so everything's going to be fine. We're going to live happily ever after. NATO is meeting in the Netherlands in just a couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, and there's an expectation that at that meeting that the NATO members themselves are going to look at what's going on in the world and say 2% GDP, not good enough anymore. Probably going to increase that number to 5%. So inasmuch as Prime Minister Carney's announcement today of that commitment to 2% may sound as if, okay, we're finally catching up, they're moving the yardsticks as we speak. And 5% is going to mean a significantly even larger contribution and dedication towards Canada's military. And when you look at what's happening these days with the incursions that we just talked about, for instance, let's talk about what's going on in the Arctic and Canada's north boundary. The Northwest Passage, you may remember studying in school, hey, what a great idea, what a commerce corridor. We always figured, okay, that's Canada's waters, Canada's sovereignty extends up there. That's being challenged. It's being challenged by the Russians. It's being challenged by the Chinese, and they've got a presence there. And, it's either step up or lose what we've got there. And we can't, as we have done in the past, simply turn to our American friends and say, look, you guys have got our back, right? Because anything that happens up there is going to impact on you. And yeah, that's true to a point, but we're not pulling our weight. And Trump is echoing with saber rattling and a number of other pompous, arrogant things that he said over the last little while to try to move us forward on this. And in as much as Trump can be a pain in the butt to listen to, and, there's very little fact in a lot of the bombast that he spouts all the time, we do have to step up with our commitment to Canada's north if we want to maintain our sovereignty up there, whether it's waterways, trade corridors, but certainly with defense as well. And to that point, I'm going to, if we could, just kind of sway into the argument and the debate about the Golden Dome that Trump has talked about. Now, that's not part of what Carney has committed to here. But when we talk about long-term military spending and Canada's commitment to its own defense and to North American defense, Trump's solution, at least in his mind anyway, is this Gold Dome project. And in a previous podcast, we discussed that and simply said that I think it's smart at this point and strategic at this point for Canada to say, yeah, we're in. Now, that doesn't mean you start writing checks. And we started talking about cost a couple of minutes ago. Trump has already put a price tag on this and said if Canada wants in, and they really say that they do, the price tag that he floated for Canada's commitment to this was about $61 billion. Well, Prime Minister Carney has already responded to that and said, look, first of all, we don't negotiate in public for that, nor should we. And secondly, and I think more importantly, Trump is just pulling those numbers out of, let's say, thin air. It's going to go now in another way, but let's put it above board here. $61 billion. He doesn't even know the cost of the whole project. So he's just pulling that in. And basically, he finished his statement by saying, oh, by the way, if you join us and become a 51st state, there's no cost to it. Now, I'm skeptical that the whole project is even going to get built the way that Trump thinks about it. He's using the Gold Dome shield, that anti-missile shield that Israel uses very effectively, of course, with some of the problems that they're doing with some of their enemy states in the Middle East. However, size matters, and it certainly matters when it comes to defense spending. Israel, as we mentioned, is about the size of a small piece of southern Ontario, maybe from about Windsor to the GTA. It's a lot easier to protect an area like that than it is across North America. So we don't know the cost, and we don't know the magnitude of this. For us to simply say, no, we're not in, I think would be a mistake at this stage, and we need to at least play along until we find out just what's going to cost. The U.S. government may not even want to go along with this in the fullness of time because of the prohibitive cost. But we need to do something to enhance our northern defenses with our American partners and with other NATO members. I don't know what the cost is going to be. Nobody does, not even Donald Trump. But we do need to at least be at the table when those discussions are ongoing. And that was my point, and I think it's Prime Minister Carney's point too. But the other element to this that we really need to pay attention, and the takeaway here, is that it's about time here in 2025 that we realize the precarious situation that's going on globally right now, and we can't simply turn our backs to it and pretend it doesn't exist, or pretend that we don't have some sort of a commitment and some sort of a responsibility to be part of the solution that's happening militarily. We need to step up. NATO has stepped up. Other member nations from NATO have all stepped up. This is not just coming from the United States. It's coming from our other NATO partners that are saying, Canada, come on, you've been great in the past. After 9/11, Canada's commitment and dedication to fighting terrorism and fighting the Taliban was fabulous, and it was well documented and I think well appreciated by most of our NATO partners, not so much by Trump, but at least from other Americans at that time too. And there are other areas where Canada can and should have a presence and do what needs to be done here. That's what being a partner in an alliance like NATO is all about. So it's an interesting story. It's a good news story because it means that we're finally realizing that we do have responsibilities here. We can't just sit back and say, well, we're a NATO member. Those people will have our back. We have to be there, and we're starting to show that with this Prime Minister. Lots more to come on this discussion, of course, in the days, weeks ahead, as we talk about where the money's going to come from, where it's going to be spent. But at least they seem to understand that, okay, we got to do this. Enough of the rhetoric, enough of the yeah, we'll get around to it. It's about time for Canada to step up, and Prime Minister Carney certainly has done that with this announcement. More to come on this, and certainly more feedback from you, too. That is this edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. You can catch us, of course, wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube, Substack, Spotify, Blue Sky, so many different places. And we always look forward to your feedback when you do jump onto the podcast. Pro or con, tell us what you think. Tell us about your thoughts and maybe even your suggestions as to where we could be going on this. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work in producing the podcast today. And don't forget, when you read the podcast or listen to it wherever you're getting your podcast from, we always include further reading material and resources as part of the package as well. By all means, delve into those and use that as some fodder for your discussions point. We got to run. Lots more coming up here, and so much more to talk about. Stick around, though, with more editions of the Bill Kelly Podcast coming up soon. Until then, stay in touch and stay informed. Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.